Good morning. It is Monday, January the 24th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. Today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare and the Star-Spangled Banner and the Pledge of Allegiance, and also the novena, we will have no free lunch, Agent Anthony Salas, rest in peace, and 2 chapters of the book, How We Got Here, the 70s, for better or for worse, the decade that brought us modern life. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. He that raised up Jesus from the dead will also give life to our mortal bodies by his Spirit that dwelleth in us. Wherefore my heart is glad, and my spirit rejoiceth. My flesh also shall rest in hope. Thou shalt show me the path of life. In thy presence is the fullness of joy, and at thy right hand there is a pleasure forevermore. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ, we commend to Almighty God our brother, Agent Anthony Salas, and we commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The Lord bless him and keep him. The Lord make his face to shine upon him and be gracious unto him. The Lord lift up his countenance upon him and give him peace. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January 24th. I will awaken you with my presence each morning. I have commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and shake the wicked out of it. Because you are upright, I will give you dominion over the foolish of this world. My glorious power will be seen, for you will wear the sacred robe of my righteousness and will shine like the morning sun with my strength. My light will break forth like the morning, and my healing will spring forth speedily. I will hear your voice in the morning as you lay your requests before me and wait in expectation. I am a fortress for you and a refuge in your times of trouble. I will satisfy you in the morning with my unfailing love, and you will be able to sing for joy and be glad all your days. Job chapter 38, verse 12, Psalms 110, verse 3, Psalms 143, verse 1 and 8. My soul waits for you, Lord, more than watchmen wait for the morning. I put my hope in you because of your unfailing love for me. Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew. Lord, your going forth is prepared as the morning, and I pray that you will come as the rain, the latter and former rain upon the earth. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January 24th.
Ready, begin.
Who is the true conservative? The true conservative is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He's the person that knows that there is no leadership in a constitutional republic. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. It is good luck to be born in America. The luck consists chiefly of a modern liberal ideology of innovism combined with reasonably honest courts and reasonably secure property rights and reasonably non-extractive governments and reasonably effective educational system and a reasonably long time for the reasonably good ideas and especially the innovations to do their work. By all means, let's spread the good luck around by persuading people to a modern liberalism leading to the great enrichment and a full life. Deidre McCloskey. Rather than bemoan those that had the good fortune to be born in a country that has made the necessary decisions to cultivate human flourishing, let us seek to spread that formula around. We ought to study and understand what has created such wealth in America, seek more of the same domestically, and share the secret sauce with the world at large. We are embracing in the modern context a shame or embarrassment for our good fortunes. Care for mankind would demand that we do the opposite. Present with pride a belief in innovation, freedom, and the good life. And that was a portion of the book No Free Lunch. Thank you, thank you. The New Work Ethic. Chapter 3 of Part 2 of How We Got Here, the 70s. During the 1973-74 football season, the New York Life Insurance Company broadcast a television ad in which a bespectacled man in white shirt and tie finds himself on a football field surrounded by uniformed hulking giants. Without warning, the ball is thrown into his hands. He starts to run. The camera cuts to the stands. There is his wife cheering, "Come on, hubby, make it for the mortgage." There is his daughter shouting, "Come on, daddy, make it for my college education." Somehow he manages to trip his way past the astonished players and cross the goal line. Wife, daughter, and dog charge joyously onto the field. A voiceover announces that New York Life can help you carry your ball too. It was an advertisement that summed up exactly what increasing numbers of American men thought was wrong with their lives. One writer commented sourly that the poor schnook with the football thinks he is being supported by the cheers of his family from the stands. In fact, every cheer is a pressure. It may be degrading to women to be regarded as sex objects. It was every bit as bad for men to be regarded as success objects. When the first baby boomers graduated from college, it was often predicted that they would turn their backs on the competitive, materialistic ways of their parents. That was the thesis of, among others, Yale law professor Charles Reich in his 1970 book, The Greening of America. The United States and the world were, Reich claimed, trembling on the cusp of a new consciousness. He called it Consciousness 3, that would scorn life-wasting work and give itself up instead to ecstasy and play. Even at the time, Reich's breathless generalizations made sensible people wince. Nobody winced, though, at Alvin Toffler's eminently serious future shock, which extrapolated from the rapidly rising productivity statistics of the 50s and 60s to conclude that Americans would soon have more leisure on their hands than they would know what to do with. Nowadays, Toffler's prophecies sound like a bad joke, as Mom furiously negotiates with clients on her cell phone while racing to pick up Meredith or Emma from ballet class, and Dad slaves late into the hours of Saturday night to ready himself for a Monday morning deposition in London. The world of Reich and Toffler seems impossibly remote. But is it really? We all think we know that Americans are working longer and harder than ever. On the other hand, federal statistics show no very impressive increase in the length of the average working day over the past quarter century. And Americans have sufficient free time to have increased their television watching by hundreds of hours per year since 1970. Can it truthfully be claimed that Americans in general work harder than they did in the day of the plow and the laundry tub, the blast furnace and the wood stove? The frantic pace of life is very much a middle-class and professional-class phenomenon, the product of two interrelated events: the rush of educated women into the workforce and changing ideas about the meaning of work. Toffler and Reich correctly perceived that the old hard-grinding work ethic was fading as society's need for it diminished. Where they erred was in supposing that a leisure ethic would take its place. Instead, the old work ethic was replaced by a new work ethic, in which one worked to fulfill itself rather than to support others. The new ethic demanded no less than the old. 70% of the college-educated people in the early 1970s said they would not welcome, quote, less emphasis on work, unquote, by society. But the purpose and motive for work, that they did want changed, with less emphasis on competition and money and more on self-fulfillment and self-expression. The GI generation, its children came to believe, had been made miserable by the obsession with achieving and the compulsion to accumulate status and prestige at the expense of one's personality and life. In July 1974, the New England Journal of Medicine reported on the results of a now famous Boston University medical experiment. The researchers had divided a sample of 2,750 men into two groups based on their psychological profile. One group, type A, was perfectionist, tense, active, energetic, and reluctant to relax. The other, type B, was placid and accepting. Men with type A behavior were twice as likely to suffer heart attacks as men with type B. Within months, the phrases type A and type B had embedded themselves into American English, and their implications had soaked into American culture. Over the half-decade from 1968 to Watergate, the pollster Daniel Yankelovich conducted a series of surveys and interviews of the attitudes toward work of the new college graduates. 2/3 of the new graduates of 73 were career-minded. But what it meant to be career-minded had changed dramatically since the 1950s. The Depression seared GIs had cared most about a job's money, prestige, security above all. They were all too ready to believe, as critics of the organization man lamented, that, quote, to make a living these days, you must do as someone else wants you to do, unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. After a brief moment of anti-materialistic giddiness in the late 60s, the college-educated baby boomers decided they agreed with their parents about the importance of money. They differed from them, however, on the importance of prestige. Only 28% of the college students of the early 1970s considered prestige an important consideration in choosing a job. More than 60% considered the ability to express oneself important. Nor was that just empty anti-elitist talk. Over the next 24 years, formerly prestigious but underpaid professions, school teachers, the foreign service, the clergy, conspicuously failed to attract talent, while occupations that were once regarded as humiliatingly servile but now seemed creative, hairdresser, chef, dressmaker, would boom. There was much mockery in the 80s of the title inflation at the top of the corporate organizational chart. New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd once imagined what would happen to the U.S. government if super agent Mike Ovitz took charge of it. Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense. Nobody's a secretary anymore. Make them all vice presidents. But nobody laughed in the 1970s when illustrators became graphic artists, beauticians became makeup artists, and dressmakers became fashion artists. In the austere 1950s, people engaged in the fine arts sneered at and kept their distance from commercial art. But that boundary blurred and then vanished altogether in the 1970s. The hot art form of the 1970s was photography, and its most acclaimed practitioner, Richard Avedon, happily snapped pictures of models and dresses for commercial fees. It was in the 1970s that movie actresses like Jane Fonda and Meryl Streep began referring to themselves as artists, a self-description that would have seemed as odd in the 50s as it would now to hear Naomi Campbell or Letitia Costa claim that title. The zeal for art reached down into the high school curriculum, promoting English into language arts and drama into theater arts. In 1970, an aspiring American artist boarded the bus to New York City. By 1980, quite moderate-sized towns, Minneapolis, Austin, and Winnipeg, had a black-garbed art scene, even if most of its members earned their living as bartenders. This trend toward expressive work was accelerated by the rush of women into the workforce. Before 1970, it was uncommon for married women to work outside the home, and even more uncommon for a mother of young children to do so. By 1980, half of married mothers of children under 6 worked for wages. Second thoughts have now developed about this trend, and it's common to hear it attributed to economic necessity, to the productivity and earnings slowdown that occurred in the 70s. There's some truth to that explanation, but only some. After all, if wives were being driven to work by economic necessity, we would expect the poorest women to be affected most. In fact, it's the wives of husbands who are in the middle of the income curve who are the likeliest to work. Wives whose husbands' wages rank in the top 10% are actually more likely to work for pay than women whose husbands' wages rank in the poorest 10%. The entry of women into the workforce is caused at least as much by new ideas about the meaning of work as the need for more family income. Quote, I must find something interesting to do for myself in the world, unquote. The mother in the 1978 tearjerker Kramer versus Kramer writes to her son, explaining why she has left home and him. Quote, everybody has to, and so do I. Being a mommy is one thing, but there are other things too, unquote. The Ms. Foundation's widely distributed children's recording, quote, free to be, you and me, unquote, drilled the same thought into hundreds of thousands of tiny ears. The sun is filled with shining light. It blazes far and wide. The moon reflects the sunlight back, but has no light inside. I think I'd rather be the sun that shines so bold and bright than be the moon that only grows or glows with someone else's light. In the late 1970s, 72% of Americans professed to spend a great deal of time thinking about their inner lives. An older work ethic would have condemned that self-absorption as a distraction from the proper subject of one's thoughts, the external world and one's tasks in it. The older ethic saw work as an end in itself and praised or condemned behavior according to whether it helped or hindered one's work. The work done in a farmer's fields and mine shafts, on the girders of skyscrapers or the assembly line, behind the counter or the adding machine was dirty, exhausting, arduous, boring, dangerous. Interesting work was a privilege reserved for a lucky few. Sure, it was a rotten job, was one of World War II veterans' appraisals of his career. But what the hell? I made a good living. I took care of my wife and kids. What more do you expect? Those were hardscrabble values formed in hardscrabble times. As America grew richer, it automated or exported to poor lands its nastiest, loneliest, and most arduous jobs. It required fewer longshoremen to break their backs moving crates onto piers, fewer meat handlers to hold frigid carcasses inches away from whirring blades, fewer tannery workers stinking of acid, fewer merchant sailors thousands of miles from home, fewer cotton pickers spending half of their lives bent in two. The American workplace became safer and more pleasant. It required less manual labor and more thinking and imagination. No company better symbolized this new imaginative economy than Apple Computer. It was founded in 1976 by a fruitarian, like a vegetarian, only minus the vegetables, druggie dropout from Reed College named Steve Jobs, and a former long-distance telephone service thief named Steve Wozniak, and incorporated the following year. Apple created the first home computer in 1977. In 1979, it unveiled a word processing program created by Paul Ludus, a one-time hippie panhandler. At the beginning of 1977, the company was valued at $5,309. At year-end 1980, publicly traded Apple was valued by the market at $1.8 billion. More than the Ford Motor Company or the Chase Manhattan Bank. Nothing could have been less hardscrabble than Apple. The company's only assets were the inventions of its employees, who had to be pampered and kept interested or they would walk out the door. So they were permitted to arrive when they pleased and to leave when they pleased, helping themselves to juice from the company refrigerator, taking their compensation in stock as well as cash, deciding for themselves what they would work on and how. Apple was an extreme case, but it bred imitators. First up and down the highways of Silicon Valley and then throughout America, Apple was, for the mass production American economy of the late 1970s, what the Pennsylvania Railroad was for the agricultural and natural resource economy of the 1870s, the harbinger of things to come. There, the parallel stopped, for the high-tech workplace of the 1970s promised to undo the rigid order and strict timetabling of the post-Civil War industrial workplace and to usher in a world in which millions of workers, not just a lucky few, would taste the satisfaction of creation. The changing nature of work changed the meaning of work. Because one was working for identity and personhood rather than for duty, one's attachment to work was both stronger and yet at the same time more conditional than it had been. The job could demand 11-hour days. It could not tell workers when those days were to begin or end. Texas Instruments abolished time clocks for workers paid by the hour. It could require overalls emblazoned with a company logo, but not a white shirt or short hair. IBM, possibly the starchiest company in America, junked its notorious white shirt rule. It could demand the full attention of mothers of infants. It could not demand that one call the boss Mr. The Walt Disney Corporation introduced a new policy requiring everyone from the president of the company on down to wear tags marked with their first name only. Executive dining rooms and reserved parking spots began vanishing from company headquarters. Robert Townsend of Avis quipped, "If you're so bloody important, you better be the first one in the office." Townsend made himself the first CEO to advocate the contemporary "are we having fun yet" style of management. You can see Townsend's influence on a walk through the bookkeeping and data processing floors of an up-to-date company. Look in the cubicles. The staff have festooned their walls and cluttered their desks with satirical cartoons, kitten calendars, mugs with jocular messages, party balloons, Dracula hand puppets, dried flowers, Magritte reproductions, and Xerox copies of last night's Letterman Top 10. In the boss's office are a basketball hoop and a Snurf gun. The new work ethic was conditional in another way, too. If work failed to provide fulfillment and meaning, there was no discredit in quitting it. Between 1970 and 1980, the proportion of married middle-aged men, that is, men between 45 and 64, who were neither at work nor looking for work, nearly doubled, from 8.8% to 15.7%. What were these 40 and 50-year-old men doing with their time? Many of them were being seduced away from the world of work by more lucrative government benefits. Fewer than 1.5 million Americans drew a federal disability pension in 1970. Nearly 3 million drew one by 1980. For those men who could not produce an injury, juicier Social Security benefits made early retirement a far more beguiling prospect. One could quit work at 62 in 1980 by accepting a pension somewhat smaller than that offered to those who worked until 65. But still much more generous than the pension that had been available even to a 65-year-old as recently as 1969. Americans had once believed that man must work at whatever work he could get. Anything was better than taking handouts. Dependence begets subservience and venality. Thomas Jefferson wrote Notes on the State of Virginia. Suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. But if work was valuable only to the extent that it was interesting, dependency might be an acceptable choice if the only work available to that person was uninteresting or, in the phrase of the time, dead end. In the early 1960s, welfare had taken the form of a small weekly cash payment. It could stave off destitution, but was in no sense a substitute for a paycheck. In the late 60s, welfare payments were raised. More importantly, they were supplanted by a battery of other benefits: Medicaid health coverage, food stamps, special aid to pregnant women and mothers of young children, federal and state housing assistance. For the first time in American history, a poor person who is neither elderly nor crippled could eke out a livelihood from the state. In 1968, only 4.1% of American families were headed by women on welfare. By 1980, 10% of families were. If idleness attained a new respectability, so too did wealth won by chance. American state governments had long sternly proscribed gambling. No state except Nevada permitted casino gambling in 1970, and only 3 had a state lottery. New York, because it needed the cash; New Jersey, because it was unwilling to see its commuters loose change end up in the New York Treasury; and New Hampshire, which saw the lottery as an alternative to taxes. The legislatures that maintained these bans were motivated by the paternalistic impulse to protect poor people from wagering away their rent money. But there was something else at work too. The vestiges of the puritanical condemnation of windfall wealth, money won by tempting fate. In the 1970s, these vestiges vanished. New York legalized off-track betting in 1971. In 1972, those former bastions of Puritan probity, Massachusetts and Connecticut, instituted state lotteries, as did Michigan and Pennsylvania. By decade's end, 14 of the 50 states, including 7 of the 10 biggest, had adopted some form of legal lottery, and New Jersey had thrown Atlantic City open to casinos. On the side of every bus, overheard at every cigarette stand interrupting the local newscasts, were the inescapable ads for lotteries, teaching in 30-second bursts a whole new attitude toward wealth. Instead of a patient accumulation throughout a lifetime of work and saving, there was a new and better way. Guess the lucky numbers, pick the lucky cards, and, hey, you never know. And that was Chapter 3 of Part 2 of the book, How We Got Here, the 70s, the decade that, for better or worse, brought us modern society. Thank you. The Courage to Divorce, Chapter 4. A society in which people are encouraged to put themselves first is not likely to be a society in which many people celebrate their golden wedding anniversaries. If it comes down to your marriage or your identity, we think your identity is more important, advised the authors of 1972's Open Marriage. And their opinion was representative. During the first 65 years of the 20th century, about 1 American marriage in 20 ended in divorce. Since 1980, more than 2 marriages out of every 5, nearly half, have ended in divorce. The United States has never seen anything like it. No society had ever seen anything like it. The divorce rate had briefly spurted after World War II as returning soldiers and their wives figured out that the marriages hastily contracted during the excitement of war were not always suited to the quiet of peacetime. Those divorces, however, predominantly involved newly married couples who were quickly correcting a youthful mistake. The divorces of the 70s, by contrast, shattered the marriages of the middle-aged. In 1972, an overwhelming 84% of Americans in their 40s were married. 10 years later, only 67% of 40-something Americans were. Do you think most Americans getting married today expect to remain together for the rest of their lives? The pollster of the Associated Press and NBC asked in 1978. 60% responded no. George Segal and Natalie Wood co-starred in 1980 in a comedy titled The Last Married Couple in America. Americans had once admired husbands and wives who sustained marriages under difficult circumstances and put their obligations to others ahead of their own personal happiness. In the 1970s, the real heroes were those who chucked their marriages. Joanna is a very unhappy woman, says the warring couple's best friend in Kramer versus Kramer. You may not want to hear this, but it took a lot of courage for her to walk out there. Indeed, remaining in a marriage was often proof of one's lack of courage, according to a book recommended by the Paragon of American Normality, Ann Landers. It is clear that all too many married couples live together while having emotionally divorced each other long ago. These are cowards. What was truly admirable was fearlessly to put one's own needs first. New York Magazine in 1972 printed the story of a 31-year-old mother of 4 from the Baltimore suburbs. After a decade of marriage, she was bored and restless. She closed the door on her house behind her, moved to New York, took a job, divorced her husband. Was I spoiled because I was taking so many other people, like my husband and children, just to pick some at random over the hill with me in my decisions? Or was I moral in the deepest sense because I would no longer, in the name of sacrifice to others like my husband and children, just to pick some at random, let slip away the one life I was given as wholly mine to do something with? Divorce was not only moral, It was healthy. It had been our experience with patients and friends, trilled the psychologist authors of one of the first popular how-to divorce guides, that both spouses, after an initial period of confusion or depression, almost without exception, look and feel better than ever before. They act warmer and more related to each other emotionally, tap sources of strength they never knew they had, enjoy their careers and their children more, and begin to explore new vocations and hobbies. Divorce was emancipating even when it became unwillingly. In the 1978 movie An Unmarried Woman, director Paul Mazursky cast Jill Clayburgh as a New York wife whose husband abandoned her for a woman he met while buying shirts at Bloomingdale's. After a spasm of humiliation and anger, Clayburgh flourishes. She takes an exciting new job managing an art gallery and rediscovers her sexuality with an artist who is both better looking and wittier than her husband. Along the way, she learns to preserve her independence at all costs. When the artist invites her to come to the Hamptons with him for the summer, she refuses in order to remain alone in the hot, sticky city. For an upper-class New Yorker, there could be no greater sacrifice. It's one of the favorite cliches of journalism to refer to the mid-century years as a more innocent time. In many ways, however, they seem to have been a time of fewer illusions than our own. The radios of the 1940s swung to jazzy, arch tunes about love. This can't be love because I feel so well. Ours ululate with gushy odes to undying passion. Earlier generations expected less and were disappointed less. Don't complain about the things they're not, sang the chorus of sailors in South Pacific's There Is Nothing Like a Dame. Be grateful for the things they've got. The chorus of women in Showboat replied, tell me he's lazy, tell me he's slow, tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Marriage was tough, marriage was burdensome, but if you made the best of it, didn't grumble, and whistled while you worked, you might find at the end that it wasn't so bad after all. But the tongue-biting look the other way, shoulder-shrugging, and yes-dearing that preserved the marriages of mid-century from altar to grave looked about as appealing to the Americans of 1970 as a dinner of Spam and canned wax beans. The self-sacrifice required to save a faltering marriage, even the lesser dose necessary to preserve a moderately happy marriage, was regarded by those who had grown up in a less arduous era as a betrayal of one's sacred obligation to oneself. Of course, I don't want to lose my husband, wrote a professedly moderate feminist in 1973. But if our relationship depends on my constantly striving to fit a particular image so I won't lose my man, it isn't worth it. A male New York publishing executive with a Yale degree who had fled to a new life in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the early 1970s complained, my marriage represents a side of me, the socially acceptable part, and I live in conflict between that side, the face that pleases other people, and what I am learning is another part of me, a part I like better. If male executives had wearied of the expectation they should live for others, their wives were positively seething against it. The trend-sensitive editors of New York Magazine observed that women's liberation had progressed from being a joke in the spring of 1969 to ubiquity by the fall, to absolute and complete hegemony by early 1970. The rebellion commenced on the island of Manhattan, but by the end of 1970, Gloria Steinem was jetting off to address women's Republican clubs from Schenectady to Pasadena, with stops at Scranton, Columbus, Jefferson City, Colorado Springs, and Boise in between. James Coonan, resident radical writer at Columbia and author of The Strawberry Statement, thought he was safe until the night the Minute Rice commercial came over the tube. Laura Jacknick, his fiancée, was scraping plates. Pre-connubial bliss on 2nd Avenue. Suddenly, the voiceover announces, yesterday it was dolls, today it's daddy's supper. On the screen is a little girl, maybe 9 or 10, happily whisking up rice on the kitchen stove. Transition shot to father gobbling up rice at the dinner table. Mother announces that his little daughter made it. Close-up of little daughter, head dipped, biting lip, proud but demure. Jim was just sitting back thinking, now there's a beautiful thing. I'd be damn proud to have a daughter like that. There it is. Look, typical. Laura wound up and let go her first plate against the wall, unscraped. Every time the commercial comes on now, she throws something. Newspapers, ashtrays. She's run out of plates. Don't laugh. Humor is irrelevant. Men of the women's liberation movement have learned not to laugh. Centuries of women before Laura Jacknick had circumscribed their lives for the sake of husband and family. But nobody was circumscribing life for anything in 1969. The boys were refusing to march off to war. Why must the girls march off to the kitchen? Men were refusing to submit to authority. Why must women submit to men? The divorce epidemic charged that question with special bitterness. After all, The Feminine Mystique had been published in 1963, although it is now remembered as the match that ignited an insurrection. For 6 years after its publication, not much happened. The spark that sputtered in 1963 blazed in 1969 and 71. Why? One reason surely must be the peculiar situation of the baby boom generation. Before World War II, higher education for women had been extraordinarily rare. Those women whose families could send them to college to earn a BA generally come from privileged backgrounds and typically married affluent men. And the first thing that privilege and affluence in those days purchased was domestic help. A woman with a college degree seldom scraped her own plates. After World War II, democratization of education, the vast increase in the number of BA holders, and the equalization of incomes repealed the exemption of educated women from domestic drudgery. Today, the witty historian Frederick Lewis Allen observed in 1952, the daughter of comfortably situated parents had better know how to cook well. As the numbers of these educated drudgers grew, so did the revolutionary potential of their underemployment. Aprons bearing the motto, "For this I went to college," suddenly began appearing on American housewives in the early 70s, and then vanished as the aprons came off. Another spark-enhancing puff came from the macho style of the anti-war movement. The young men who denied the Vietnam draft very naturally wanted to scotch any imputation that their unwillingness to fight might be motivated by cowardice, that they lacked that favorite 60s word, balls. Hence, the famous belligerence of the New Left. Nobody could call a young man who occupied the dean's office and faced down the guns and tear gas of the campus police a coward, right? Hence, too, the left's brutal attitude toward women, summed up by most notoriously by Stokely Carmichael's quip that the position of women in the movement was prone. The women of the movement had obligingly served the coffee while their brave men confronted Lyndon Johnson's police state. But as the war wound down, it began to occur to some of these women that they had been played for saps. No situation comedy of the 70s was complete without a scene in which a long-suffering woman denounces her chauvinistic husband or boyfriend and walks out the door. In real life, it happened at least as often the other way around. First the breakup, then the outburst of rage. Much ink has been spilled on the question of whether it was men or women who rebelled first against the strictures of marriage. What can one say for certain is that the demographics of sex in the 70s favored men more starkly than at any other time in the century. Men typically marry women a few years younger than themselves. Women typically chose men a few years older. No news there, but against the background of the baby boom, that tendency had huge consequences. A 45-year-old man divorcing his 40-year-old wife in 1977 would be able to choose his second mate from the enormous generation born after 1946. His ex-wife would have to look for a husband among the comparatively tiny numbers of men born between 27 and 1937. This was not a theoretical problem. The proportion of women aged 25 to 34 who had been divorced and had not subsequently remarried nearly tripled between 1950 and 1975. The sudden determination to rewrite family law in sex-neutral ways was bolstered the male demographic advantage. Before 1970, most states drew a distinction between uncontested divorces, which could proceed relatively quickly, and contested divorces, which could drag on for years. This imposed a powerful incentive on the more eager party, usually the husband, to come to terms with the less eager, typically the wife. In 1969, California rewrote its divorce laws to eliminate the distinction between contested and uncontested divorce. And over the next 8 years, all but 3 of the 50 states followed. The usual new rule was that an unhappy spouse need only remove himself from the house and wait for a few months. After 6 months or a year's separation, a divorce would be granted at the request of either party. The wife's leverage was gone. Nor did the laws tilt against the unwilling spouse halt there. The 1969 California divorce reform put an end to the old bias in favor of maternal custody. Either parent could apply to have the children live with him or her. The California lawmakers and their imitators in the rest of the country were moved by the ideal of sexual equality. But the new unisex custody rules put a powerful new weapon in the hands of husbands, who, by threatening to apply for custody, could bring pressure on their wives to scale down their financial demands. Feminist writers like Susan Faludi in Backlash expressed great puzzlement at the plunging size of divorce settlements in the 1970s. But it should be no mystery. Enhance the bargaining power of husbands, weaken the bargaining power of wives, and smaller settlements are exactly what you can expect. They're all pigs underneath, said one of Erica Young's bitter characters in her 1977 novel about her divorce. Even my illustrious Alan, with his cute vasectomy scar and his men's CR group. You can take it as a rule of thumb. Pigs is pigs. With extremely rare exceptions, feminist writers chirruped unconcernedly through this vast collective trauma. One of those exceptions published a surprisingly successful 1979 book titled directly enough, Women Who Kill. Women Who Kill find extreme solutions to problems that thousands of women cope with in more peaceable ways from day to day. In her 1976 pop psychology mega-hit Passages, Gail Sheehy assembles testimonial after testimonial to the transformative power of divorce. So much so, she said, that I began to wonder if divorce is a rite of passage. Is this ritual necessary before anyone, above all herself, will take a woman's need for expansion seriously? To many of the new feminists, in fact, the abandoned middle-aged woman fully deserved her fate, condign punishment for having once accepted dependence on a man. I cannot get excited about women who are threatened by the thought of being responsible for their self-support without alimony, sniffed one female proponent of easier divorce. Perhaps 30 or 50 years ago, economic conditions totally excluded women. Currently, opportunities are available to both men and women. Women can no longer live off the complaint that they had no awareness of their alternatives as teens, as wives and mothers, or as career women. The past is past, and what women are accountable for is what they choose and do now. The revocation of the old promise that marriage meant assured support as long as they live may be one of the best things that could happen to women, wrote feminist sociologist Jessie Bernard in her influential 1972 textbook, The Future of Marriage. It would demand that even in their early years, they think in terms of lifelong work histories. It would demand the achievement of autonomy. They would have to learn that marriage was not the be-all and end-all of their existence. It would not free them from the necessity of knowing how to take care of themselves. It would save them from the pitfalls of too much security. All this would actually be a blessing in a not very impenetrable disguise. For if it is good for men to be saved from normalness by hemming them in, it is good for women to be forced out of their security. It costs too much. Other feminists might protest against the sexual objectification of women. Bernard understood, to the contrary, that liberation would force women to think ever more obsessively about their beauty. If commitments are to be limited, women will have to learn to remain attractive. Indeed, they can do so well on into their 50s, and even, folk cliches to the contrary notwithstanding, beyond. And after that, if they make it so far, living with oneself can be an exciting odyssey. It was an odyssey that more and more women began embarking upon. There were only 480,000 divorces in the entire United States in 1965. In 1969, there were 640,000 in 1971, 773,000, and in 1975, more than 1 million. By then, divorce was so pervasive that even the religious denominations most hostile to it, high church Protestants and Roman Catholics, had to make their peace. In October 1973, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church voted to recognize the validity of civil divorce, ending the long delays for remarriage within the church that Episcopalians had once faced. The Catholic Church relented too. Between 68 and 81, the number of annulments granted jumped 77-fold. 1 million American children lost their families to divorce in each year of the 70s, but the experts counsel parents not to worry. We see no reason for parents to apologize to their children for deciding not to be married anymore. Children would not feel so wronged if their parents did not feel so sorry. If parents put a positive spin on their separation, the children would not embarrass them by crying and carrying on. One wise mother is supposed to have phrased her announcement thus: "Children, I have good news for all of us. There's going to be more happiness in this house from now on. Daddy and I have decided not to live together anymore, and we will all be happier because of this." "Phew," the woman's 9-year-old daughter replied. "I thought you were going to tell us that we had to get rid of the kitty." Only now, as those children reach maturity and tell their stories, are we begin to hear the children's own version of events. How many scenes were there like this from a novel by the daughter of a famous journalist? Let's write him letters, Mom said, and if we tell him how much we miss him, he'll come back. Mom's eyes were puffy and red, but she smiled a wide, hopeful smile. I love my little girls, she said. He loves his little girls. My heart started to race. I thought maybe Dad didn't know how much we missed him. So we wrote furiously on pads of white paper. I wrote, I love you, just I love you, at least 100 times all over my blank white page. And that was chapter 4 of part 2 of the book, How We Got Here. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, wishing all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there adios, and to remind you that to be honest, to be smart, and to be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.